Hello and welcome back to another episode of Veritas Live. And today we're talking about charting a better Kubernetes course. Now, before we chart that course, we actually need to know geographically where you are from. So if you don't mind, in the chat, let us know where you're watching from today. And we're also going to be taking questions throughout the show. So if you'd like, please put a question if something piques your interest and use the hashtag Veritas Live. We will try to get to it and ask it to our guest experts. And speaking of our guests, we have three today, and they're all fantastic. We've got Joe D'Angelo, Senior Product Manager of InfoScale. We've got Tushar Katarki, who's the Director of Product Management for Red Hat OpenShift, and Steve O'Grady, who's a co-founder at RedMonk. Welcome, gentlemen. Glad to have you here. Now, as you know, and as our audience knows, we like to start every episode with an icebreaker. So today's icebreaker is, what is the most outrageous Kubernetes setup you have ever seen? Tushar, let's start with you.
Thanks, Anthony, and hi everyone. I think there are a lot of outrageous things in Kubernetes, but I think the funniest one that I think I've seen is kind of a chaos engineering GitHub contribution, wherein you kind of use Doom to kill pods so that you can do chaos engineering testing on Kubernetes. I thought that was very kind of quirky and interesting and kind of funny. So I thought that was very outrageous.
I love it. They'll put Doom on anything these days, so doesn't surprise me at all. Steve, what's your most outrageous Kubernetes setup you've seen?
I don't know about outrageous. I think the funniest ones that I see, and I see these actually with some frequency, are the developers who run sort of their own personal blog, with a couple dozen entries, and they run a full kitted out cluster, backed by Kubernetes. So not so outrageous, but probably a little overkill there. And like I said, I've seen a bunch of those.
I'm not surprised at all. And Joe, what's your take?
First of all, thanks for having me, Anthony. I would say that the most wild Kubernetes deployment that I have heard of is actually in terms of scope. We were working with a customer who actually had 60,000 compute nodes deployed. That's nodes, not containers, actual nodes. It's outrageous that that's how large they're going, and these are in production. So yeah, there are some absolutely massive deployments out there, and that certainly is the wildest one I've seen.
I love it. A lot of different directions this icebreaker went. I think each was its own interesting, definitely outrageous setup. So let's talk a little bit about the current state of things today, as far as just Kubernetes is being used, who's using it, and why. Steve, I'm curious to hear your take. What is the current state of Kubernetes?
So I think the current state of Kubernetes, I think the simplest way to describe it is that it's effectively the enterprise substrate, right? In the sense that, if you go back enough years, there were, sort of a number of competing container orchestration options. And frankly, if you go back even further, we had a number of different sort of application platforms, J2E sort of being the most notable of those. And Kubernetes is effectively that today, right? It's a substrate on which, huge swaths of enterprise infrastructure run. And, what we've seen over time is just this sort of steady progression of, Kubernetes starts in one area, and then there's areas where we're not going to use it for that, or we can't use it for that. And, the next quarter, the next couple quarters, the next year or two, it ends up being used for the things that people said it couldn't do. So, yeah, I think when we speak with people today, basically, I think the simplest description is that it is just that. It's a substrate for, a huge majority at this point of, sort of what enterprises want to do from a technical infrastructure perspective.
I love it. It's you describe it very organically, which I think is a neat way to think about Kubernetes as a subject. Tushar, what's your take on the current state?
Yeah, I'll echo what Steven said, that it is definitely that, and it has definitely. I see use cases every day, interesting use cases, interesting ways in which customers are deploying it, using it, delivering value for their customers. Going back. The journey itself has been, if you go back to 2014 and look at DockerCon when it was first launched, and where we are. I mean, a handful of developers, maybe Google and Red Hat being the only earliest contributors with some startups, and now we have thousands of companies contributing, and so I think it is going strong, I think, and forms the basis of a lot of new and interesting things that are being used to deliver value to customers.
Absolutely. And Joe, just given your icebreaker, I'm sure you have an interesting take on the current state of Kubernetes today.
Well, the way I see it and the experiences I've had thus far has been that I think Kubernetes and in general, the container ecosystem has really delivered on the promise of virtualization, right? This idea, I like to call it as all the flavor and none of the calories, where you can truly take full advantage of the infrastructure and exploit it to its ultimate potential. And bridge the divide between what was a development effort and a truly an infrastructure need. So it's an exciting time, and I'm just glad to be part of it.
It certainly is. Now, before we move on to our next question, I do want to call out, we did have some pretty interesting locations from our audience today. So San Jose, California, we have someone from Istanbul watching, someone joining from Pune, India. Thank you for joining us today. We are excited to have you here. Now, we talked about the current state, and I actually want to step back a little bit and talk somewhat about the rise of containers and Kubernetes market adoption. And Tushar, given your experience with Red Hat OpenShift, I thought you'd be a great one to lead this. So when did this become the push, and what is it looking at from a market adoption perspective?
Yeah, I mean, I kind of alluded to it a little earlier. I mean, it kind of started really with Docker, and Docker, really what they were trying to solve really is, developers want to write the programs once, and they want it to be deployed on any substrate, on any infrastructure. And so I think Docker came along, and really on Linux, the container technology was already there in Linux, and a lot of people forget that. But I think what Docker brought really is this made it very portable, a image layering format that made it very portable, and it was very developer friendly. But where Kubernetes came in really was the idea that, okay, look, I mean, if you want to deploy this as an application, is typically more complex than just one container, and especially if you want that container, I think a useful analogy that I thought was interesting has been made is kind of the post office analogy, in which you want to send packages or letters, and you put it in a package, and you just send it out with an address and a destination. You put a stamp, and that sends you wherever. And that's effectively what Kubernetes did for this, which was missing if you can't just have a container format. And so that's what Kubernetes did. And since then the adoption has been tremendous. I have some stats here which gives you an idea. When you think about adoption, you can think about in terms of community, what's the ecosystem, users and adopters, and then what are the use cases and workloads. So if you start with the community, just some statistics here, 2.8 million contributions to Kubernetes made by companies with, it's close to 2 million lines of code now. I mean, 4,100 plus companies contributing to Kubernetes. The broader ecosystem, and I'm talking about the CNCF ecosystem that it has spawned, really has 120 plus projects which are above and beyond Kubernetes itself, with 142,000 contributors, from about 190 countries. And then just in December 2021 report, saw Kubernetes being used by developers, and that adoption growing up by 67% to 5.6 million users and developers. And so that's a huge number. In some recent surveys from CNCF, 96% of organizations are either using or evaluating Kubernetes, which is a record high. Since these surveys, they do it annually, CNCF does. I mean, Red Hat has done a number of surveys. We continue to see some similar things, and particularly OpenShift. I've been on this journey with OpenShift for many years now, and we have 3,000 plus enterprise customers, for example. OpenShift being our commercial distribution of Kubernetes. So, and we see a lot of use cases and workloads, everything from cloud to on-premise to edge. You can think about, Kubernetes now being, obviously in the data center, in the cloud, but also in space, in submarines, et cetera. So that just gives you how, widespread usage it is. It's being used for cloud native applications, for lift and shift, for data analytics, AI and machine learning. The HPC community is adopting it and they love it, and then across a host of industries, everything from scientific computing to financial services, energy, defense, manufacturing, transportation, and logistics. I mean, automobiles, we sometimes jokingly think about the planes and automobiles movie when we describe Kubernetes and OpenShift and how prolific it is. So I think it's fantastic. I love it. And it has grown quite a significant and continues to do so. As Stephen said, the substrate for enterprise applications.
I never thought we would hear Kubernetes in space on this show, but here we are. I love it. And just the fact that you went down that number of contributions route and how many people are just actively contributing to this open source solution, it's amazing. And Steve, I'm curious from your experience, helping customers with their Kubernetes journey, what are you seeing from an adoption standpoint?
I mean, I think the point made was entirely correct, right? It's everywhere, right? So in other words, from our standpoint, we are believers that developers and practitioners are leading, sort of procurement adoption, sort of technologies and container technologies and the way that Docker sort of neatly packaged them and popularized them. That grew containers faster than really any other technology we've seen in multiple decades. And, just the act of like, hey, I can take, dependencies for an application, sort of as just one example, very lightly package them up in tiny sort of little images, share them easily, deploy them, have consistency in terms of, sort of what's being deployed. Developers loved it, right? And used it, sort of in droves. And, consequently, enterprises were kind of obligated to figure out, all right, if we're going to run this in production and if we're going to run a bunch of these, like, how do I orchestrate this, right? How do I decide what runs where? So, what ended up happening was, we have a bunch of developers who want to use something, they'll find a way to use it. And, sort of the enterprise, was more or less forced to accommodate. And, Kubernetes, sort of as mentioned earlier, came out of a sea of, sort of would-be contenders, for that role. And really has become the sort of more or less de facto industry standard in that regard. So from an adoption standpoint, it's everywhere containers are, really, which is, the simpler way of saying it's everywhere, right? You can find it in, obviously, enterprise data centers. You can find it in the cloud. You can find it in virtually every IoT scenario you can think of. Any kind of device, any kind of, vehicle in many cases. I had not been aware of space. That was a new one for me. But, I think the simple way to put it is just, Kubernetes is going to be something that everybody's going to run into at an enterprise at some form or fashion.
Right.
And that's certainly what we're seeing, at least when we talk to basically enterprises of all shapes and sizes.
I love how you talk about the adoption of Kubernetes sort of dragging the enterprise along with it. It's an unstoppable force meeting that immovable object type situation, and I think Kubernetes is going to win that fight. So actually, I think that's a great pivot into our next topic. And Joe, I really want to hear from you on this one. And if you wouldn't mind, I've heard you're a little quiet, so just move a little closer to your microphone.
Okay.
But I want to hear your take on some of the pros and cons, as well as the pain points of Kubernetes in its course of adoption, as well as what your thoughts on some of the solutions are.
Well, certainly the pros have been widely discussed thus far today, and I think that obviously, portability, the amount of scale that you can derive from Kubernetes, the advantages you gain from managing such a diverse set of workloads. I mean, I think that's pretty much well established. I don't think there's necessarily cons as much as there are considerations, and I think that there was the old adage of don't want to put your eggs in one basket. Well, you can put your eggs in one basket as long as you don't take your eyes off that basket. And in the case of any container technology or virtualization technology, it's important to understand that as you create a more densely concentrated environment, as you tend to put more emphasis on a smaller footprint of physical infrastructure, as that virtual infrastructure starts to expand, you have to be a little bit more cognizant of the performance of that environment, the scale of that environment, how you're going to recover that environment, the relationships that those environments have with other infrastructure that may not be native to Kubernetes. Just like, we've seen how this movie's played out, right? As technologies get adopted, they may not begin in the enterprise, but they certainly end up in the enterprise. And they don't completely displace all of the preceding technologies. So what you have to find yourself is in a situation is, do you create net new disciplines, net new supporting technologies just for your Kubernetes infrastructure? Or do you look at trying to evolve that in a way that you now can manage your data center, which is becoming more heterogeneous, more diverse? So those are some of the things that we see as one of the challenges. And some of the comments we've gotten from customers over time has really been, we don't really care necessarily where the problems we face exist, if they are within the application itself, if they are within the physical infrastructure, if they are within the network. We just want to understand that we're protected. We just want to understand that we are resilient in the face of all of the demands that are now placed upon these environments, which don't go away. Right? Moving to a different orchestration layer does not absolve you of the responsibilities of your applications, of those applications in turn to your customers. So we see it as being, taking full advantage and exploiting Kubernetes to its fullest potential, but at the same time recognizing that there are, enterprise demands that have to be placed upon that, or are placed upon that, and you have to be prepared for it and ready for it, no matter where the problems may occur.
I like that you kind of qualified it as those enterprise demands. And Tushar, coming from the Red Hat perspective, what's your take on what the enterprise demands as far as the pain points of Kubernetes is concerned?
Yeah, I think the main ones really are, Kubernetes is a complex system, and there is no doubt about that, right? I mean, it's a complex piece of software. It does a lot of things, and also Kubernetes itself. It's cleverly written in the sense of, in spite of how complex it is, it is made of, primitives, and it is made of APIs, but that means that you have to write additional logic either through some of those projects that I described earlier, which comes from there, or you have to do some bespoke things within your enterprise to take advantage of it, right? Like, it's like Linux. And if Linux is, true practitioners of Linux use it in different ways, and they know how to take advantage of the APIs. And this is Linux multiplied by 10 times complexity just because it's a distributed system. So I think that is one part of it. The other part of it is, in spite of this, it is quite popular, as we discussed earlier, but that popularity means that now, enterprises have to think about IT administrators and people who are engineering these systems and providing it for their consumers, have to think about, how do I manage it? How do I secure it? How do I be compliant with regards to the various compliance factors and security and compliance is really, really big. For various reasons, of late has been on the news a lot. And then and I said, how do I think it was mentioned earlier how they want it to be as self-managing as possible, right? So that's kind of the holy grail, if I can use that word. To get there, and so it's a journey to get there. So and so those are some of the challenges that I see, and also obviously talent. I shouldn't. This is really still a technology, as I said, which is somebody needs to know and understand it, and to maintain and operate it, etc. So those are some of the things that I hear from customers.
If you don't mind, one of the comments you made about the data center, it brings up this notion of really creating an autonomous infrastructure, right? This idea that Kubernetes will deliver on the promise of that end-to-end workflow where you have the development of new applications and new services and the delivery of them in one continuous, operation. And I think that that's a goal that pretty much every customer I've ever spoken with, and I myself as a consumer of the technology at one point, would absolutely want to aspire to. And I think that's really that's the driving force behind a lot of this is, these little discrete pockets of technology that exist in the data center create, while maybe individually some advantages, on a scale, for across your enterprise tend to be a little bit more, cost prohibitive. They tend to be a little more complicated to maintain over time. And certainly when you consider things like, transitions and upgrades and migrations and all that, those tend to get more complicated as well. And I think the idea of Kubernetes being able to create a sort of an umbrella to help to streamline all of that, to simplify all of that, I think is a key point too.
I really like how both of you have really highlighted not only the context of the challenges, but some solutions as well. And I just want to make mention that Veritas recently published an article named Kubernetes an Achilles heel in defense against ransomware attacks. And last year we saw Siloscape come out through Kubernetes, and then just last week we saw Cryoscape, which takes advantage of a vulnerability inside of Kubernetes. So do take sort of a proactive approach when it comes to the management of your Kubernetes, and don't leave it by itself. Does need help, and take a look at that article. I'm sure you'll find some answers in there as well. Now, I know we're coming up on time, but I do want to get through this last question. So one prediction. I want one prediction from each of you as we talk about the future of Kubernetes. Let's start with Steve.
I would say the future of Kubernetes for me is that software developers in particular, but a variety of engineers, just see less of it. Right. What we're seeing sort of in a variety of contexts is Kubernetes under the hood, but sort of fading into the woodwork, so to speak. So that sort of a given software developer or sort of other engineers' direct contact with it is sort of indirect in many cases at best. So, if we're looking sort of a couple years out, Kubernetes is probably on a hood somewhere, but do developers, have all that much to do with it? Probably not.
That made a lot of people who have seen Kubernetes but haven't integrated with it directly very excited. Joe, what's your take? What's your prediction for the future?
So let me get out my crystal ball here. I would say that if I had to think of one area, would be the complete abstraction of infrastructure, be it public cloud, be it hyperconverged infrastructure, be it traditional physical infrastructure, by way of the Kubernetes orchestration, where effectively you will have that the ultimate level of portability for workloads, and that pretty much everything under the covers will be homogenized. That is the direction that we want to move into. I don't think there's a lot of folks out there who probably don't appreciate that, because that might make them less differentiated, but that is the inevitability of where we're going.
Absolutely, and it makes perfect sense as well. Tushar, what's your final prediction?
Yeah, this is great. Stephen talked about how, make Kubernetes less visible or invisible to developers, and similarly, Joe talked about make it to infrastructure. And I'll take the third angle, which is make Kubernetes less visible or invisible to admins, and we talked about the self-healing part of it earlier. So, especially with, interesting, we are getting a lot of data about Kubernetes and clusters, and we'll continue to improve that and add constructs so that, Kubernetes itself and the cluster or clusters and the whole system is as self-healing, so that, admins can actually be rest assured that they don't have to interfere with the system system unless there is abnormal circumstances, etc. So we'll get there, and hopefully, as I said, eventually, they're completely self-managed and self-healing in that sense. So we're certainly on that journey. So I think we'll get there I'd say it will take 2 to 3 years to get there, but yeah.
You know, what's funny is in that study we mentioned earlier, I had a chance to read through it a few days ago. We talk about how in 5 years, we predict, based on the data we collected, 87% of all enterprises will be using Kubernetes in some form or fashion. So I think all three of your predictions line up with that statistic quite nicely. So we're in complete alignment. So I do want to say thank you to our guests, Steve, Joe, Tushar. Y'all have been amazing and incredibly informative. So thank you for being here with us today. I have some call outs I'd like to make. So if you want to learn more about what Steve does, be sure to check out the RedMonk website. RedMonk is an incredibly helpful partner to team up with when it comes to things like Kubernetes adoption. And check out Steve's blog. That's redmonk.com/SOGrady. You'll be able to find that and get all your tips and tricks there. Excuse me. If you want to stay in touch with Tushar, check out his LinkedIn page. Great way to keep on touch with what Red Hat and OpenShift are up to. And speaking of, you can always try out Red Hat OpenShift today. So we encourage you get out there and you start experimenting and playing around with it for yourself. And lastly, we want to make a call out to our very own Veritas' Sonny Anthony, who's a senior principal, SQA engineer for storage and SDS. He wrote steps to containerize Oracle with InfoScale in a Red Hat OpenShift environment. So a little bit of partnership happening there as well. If you're curious to learn how to do that for yourself, do check out that link. And as always, that's our show. We want to thank you for being here, each and every one of you. We appreciate your participation in Veritas Live as well. We will see you in 3 weeks. We hope to see you there.